hopefully it won't happen again. If Mary Lou was still our dean, or Judy, I'm sure that we would have better equipment than this, and it would
For sure.
And Ed is our poster boy for that first slide. He's that leg over there on the right.
We're going to turn in leg slices every year to see how we're doing.
Okay, so where I was saying that fundamentally that yes, we've seen big changes in the average life expectancy, but we haven't seen anywhere near that many changes in the maximum life expectancy. And I think that that's really what the biology of aging research is about. It's telling us that, yeah, how do we get more people to live to closer to the maximum? I don't see the maximum life expectancy changing anytime soon. Okay, so now let's actually talk about the biology of what's going on as we get older. I have about 6 different things that I want to say about how our cells and tissues change with age. And the first one has to do with elasticity. So the elasticity of our tissues is driven by this tissue called elastin. And when it's at relaxed, it has this really coiled configuration. And when it stretches, then it all straightens out. And then when the tension is removed, it recoils back to that original configuration. And there's very little turnover in elastin in our body. You're basically still working with the same elastin that you made in your tissues when you were growing as a child. And over the decades since then, that elastin has just accumulated damage from all sorts of things. So in the skin, ultraviolet light damages it. If you smoke, chemicals in cigarette smoke damage it. Glycation, that means glucose molecules can be stuck to it if your blood sugar levels are too high. It can get calcified, it can get damaged by reactive oxygen molecules. These are byproducts of metabolism. We'll be talking more about them later. And so all this accumulated wear and tear means that our tissues get less elastic as we get older. And this is the most obvious in the skin. So if you pinch the skin of someone who's young, it recoils very quickly, whereas somebody who's older, you get much more pronounced prolonged tenting where the skin stays up for a lot longer. But that's mostly cosmetic. A much bigger issue is the elasticity of internal organs like our elastic arteries. So when the heart beats, the arteries near the heart recoil, they expand. And then when the heart relaxes, they recoil back to their original configuration. And that helps push the blood along, so that some of the work of pushing the blood through your system is not being done directly by the heart, it's being done by the elastic recoil from your arteries. As you get older and you lose elasticity, then those blood vessels get stiffer and they're no longer able to expand and recoil. And then the heart has to do all the work. And that leads to wear and tear on the heart, and that leads to reduced ability to increase cardiovascular performance during exercise, because so much of the heart's workload is being done just pumping the blood, since it doesn't have the assist from the recoil of the arteries. To the best of my knowledge, nobody has figured out a way of reversing this. That elasticity loss seems to be one of the fundamental characteristics of aging, and maybe part of what's determining the maximum lifespan of humans. But we can certainly reduce the wear and tear through lifestyle choices. So if you want to live to be old, don't smoke, and that will reduce elasticity damage and keep your blood glucose under control. And if you care about skin elasticity, then don't spend so much time in the sun. I mean, those things will reduce the damage, but there isn't anything at the moment we can do to undo the damage once it's happened. The next 2 things I want to talk about have to do with the DNA in our cells. And one of those is telomeres. So telomeres are the caps on the end of our chromosomes. They don't have any genes in them themselves, but they help protect the other parts of the DNA. And so, and they're really hard for cells to copy. When a cell gets ready to divide, it has to copy its DNA. And to do that, it takes the 2 strands of DNA and it pulls them apart. And then it uses each strand as a template to make a new strand. And the enzyme that copies those strands of DNA can only travel one direction on the chromosome. And it can only make DNA starting from a molecule called a primer. And if a primer doesn't happen to get made right at the very end of the DNA, then there won't be any way to copy that extra end bit. Anything upstream of the first primer won't be able to be copied, because the enzyme can only go one direction, and it can only start when there's a primer there. And so that last little end bit of DNA is not going to be able to be copied. And so what this means is that with every round of cell division, the telomeres on the cells get progressively shorter. And if they get too short, when the telomeres are completely gone, then the cell can't divide anymore. And it either dies or it becomes a kind of semi-dormant cell called a senescent cell. And so telomere shortening is one of the fundamental characteristics of aging. This has led people to say, well, is there anything we can do about this? Can we reverse the shortening of telomeres, and would that lead us to live longer? Well, there are some cells that can reverse telomere shortening, that can copy the telomeres and make them long. And we see that in the germline cells. These are the cells that are going to become eggs and sperm. This is so that the next generation can inherit a full length of telomere and start young, start from scratch. And stem cells, so cells in your body that have to divide a whole lot, like the cells in your gut only live a couple of days, and so they have to constantly be replaced by stem cells that live in the crevices of your intestines. And they have to have ways of lengthening telomeres, or at least maintaining telomeres. And they do that with an enzyme called telomerase. And it basically has a built-in template that allows it to add bases onto the ends of the DNA and make the telomeres get long again. And this has led to a lot of interest. Like, is this something we could get other cells to express? Could we reverse aging by turning on telomerase in other body cells? And if you look in the dark corners of the internet, you will find that people will sell you almost anything, including a medication that purports to turn on telomerase and therefore lengthen the telomeres in your cells. This is probably a good time to remind you that I'm not a healthcare provider, and nothing I say should be considered medical advice. However, this is a place where I would be pretty dubious. For one thing, there's been very few, or if any, clinical trials to suggest that it works. And what research is out there suggests that this particular compound has poor oral bioavailability, meaning that if you eat it, it's highly unlikely to actually get to your cells and do anything. So probably you'd be wasting your money and it wouldn't do anything at all. But if it does actually work, if it does actually get to the cells and turn on telomerase, then that might be worse, because the other kind of cell that has telomerase are cancer cells. This is part of what lets cancer cells keep dividing over and over, is they have figured out how to turn on telomerase. And so if we had a medication out there that turned on telomerase in our body cells, we might not actually live longer, because we might then have cancer popping up all over. So I don't think we're going to solve telomerase shortening in the near term. Okay, so I said two things about the DNA of cells we're going to talk about. Shortening telomeres, that's one. The other thing, it has to do with patterns of gene expression. So all the cells in our body have the same DNA, but they don't all use the same DNA. Like a liver cell or a skin cell, they're going to have to use different genes to do their different jobs. And the way that those genes are regulated, one of the ways that they're turned off if they're not needed, is by sticking on little chemical signals called methyl groups. So down there in the bottom, you can see the red circle, that's around a methyl group. It's just a carbon with some hydrogens. And when that gets stuck to DNA, that's one way we turn off genes. So a skin cell turns off all the genes it doesn't need to do its job as a skin cell. Well, when those cells divide, they have to copy the methylation pattern so that the daughter cells also have that pattern of methylation and that pattern of gene expression. And cells have a way of doing this. They have a way of copying the DNA methylation patterns, but it's not perfect. And so as we get older, we get fewer methyl groups stuck onto our DNA, and we get genes being turned on that really shouldn't be turned on. So when we say a gene is being turned on, we mean first it's copied into this temporary set of instructions, and then that gets used to make proteins. And so we get proteins being made in our cells that really shouldn't be being made. But then probably what's worse than that is that some of the DNA in our cells is not actually instructions for making proteins. It's old viruses that we got infected with hundreds of thousands or even millions of years ago, that their DNA got incorporated into our DNA and they're just hanging out there in this, as junk DNA. And most of the time they don't do anything because we keep them turned off with methyl groups stuck on them. But as we get fewer methyl groups on our DNA with age, some of that junk viral DNA starts being expressed, at least into the form of RNA, that temporary message. And the cell interprets that as a sign of a viral infection. And so it turns on all these inflammatory signals, which are really useful if you're dealing with a short-term infection. But long-term inflammation, the kind that would be produced if you had constant expression of this inappropriate DNA, long-term inflammatory signals are behind a lot of damage that is associated with aging. So if we're going to solve issues of aging, then solving this problem of reduced methylation is going to be critical. And this is a place where there's been some interesting breakthroughs. So this journal article, this came out in Nature, which is a very respected scientific publication, in 2020, and they used a clever type of genetic engineering to remethylate to reestablish the original methylation pattern in cells in mice eyes. And they found that some of the age-related vision loss actually got reversed. They figured out how to reverse some of the signs of aging by fixing the problem of reduced methylation. So they're saying, okay, we figured out how to do this in animals. It seems quite possible that in the medium term, we could see this get translated into people. So I think this is an area to keep an eye on as we go forward in aging research. Okay, so a third thing that's happening in cells that doesn't directly relate to the DNA, but that's also associated with aging, is the accumulation of mitochondrial damage. So mitochondria are organelles inside our cells that make the energy, the ATP molecule that we use to do cellular work. And so mitochondria take nutrients from our food and they take oxygen and they burn those nutrients in a controlled kind of way to produce waste and ATP. The problem is that they also produce these reactive oxygen molecules. These are the ones I mentioned earlier about that can damage elastin. Fundamentally, what they are is they're oxygen molecules that have the wrong number of electrons. So they ricochet around in our cells, frantically stealing electrons from other molecules, causing a lot of damage. So they damage the mitochondria, they escape the mitochondria and damage other cell structures. They escape cells and they damage the proteins between our cells, like elastin. And so if we're going to solve problems of aging, we definitely need to figure out how to deal with these reactive oxygen molecules, especially since it becomes this kind of nasty feedback loop, where as mitochondria get damaged, then they become less able to control their production of reactive oxygen molecules, which leads them to be further damaged, which then they become even less able to control their production of the reactive oxygen molecules. So if we're going to solve issues of aging, we definitely have to figure out this. And this is a place where there's actually a lot of really active research, and I think we'll see some progress being made. The one thing that we know extends lifespan in everything we've ever looked for it in, from nematodes to rhesus monkeys, is caloric restriction or periodic times of not eating. That's the intermittent fasting. The graph over here shows if you restrict calories, the more calories you restrict, the longer your mice live. And what seems to be happening is that when we take in food, we burn that in our mitochondria for energy, and that produces those reactive oxygen molecules that cause damage. That food also, though, triggers this cell pathway that leads to protein synthesis and growth and cell division. And these are obviously important things that we need to be doing at least some of the time. But when we don't eat, we get less of those reactive oxygen molecules, we also inhibit this particular pathway. And instead of triggering protein synthesis, it triggers protein recycling. And some of those proteins that get recycled have accumulated damage. So this just overall cleanup seems to be associated with increased lifespan. So cleaning up cells by switching cells into this TOR inhibited pathway, it seems to be a fundamental thing that increases lifespan. The problem is nobody wants to do it. Like, food is one of the great pleasures of life, and very few people are willing to significantly restrict calories in order to reap the benefits of caloric restriction and increased lifespan. So this has led people to ask, well, can we come up with a way of getting these same benefits without actually having to restrict calories? And the answer is maybe. So this protein recycling pathway that's moderated by this molecule TOR. TOR is called TOR. It stands for target of rapamycin, because there's a drug called rapamycin that specifically inhibits it and shifts the cell into the protein recycling and cleanup pathway, even in the presence of food. So something like rapamycin might produce the benefits of fasting without actually having to not eat. The problem with rapamycin is that it's a pretty nasty drug. It's an immunosuppressant. So you might find taking it, extends lifespan by reducing damage and cleaning up cells, but it ends up killing you off anyway because you get the flu. It also has some really nasty side effects. So I made a list of them. It causes anemia, constipation, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. I mean, these are not side effects that we want a bunch of people to be experiencing long term. So rapamycin is not the answer, although we have gotten pretty clever about drug design, and it may be we could find a molecule that was kind of like rapamycin, but that didn't actually have the same side effects. So maybe we could figure out how to directly inhibit that TOR pathway. We have ways of cleaning up the reactive oxygen molecules. So these antioxidants, that's what they do, is they clean up reactive oxygen molecules. And so vitamins D and E and resveratrol, which is found in red wine, although probably not in really significant amounts, these are cleaning up these molecules. And I think here's an example of something that was also obvious when we talked about the elasticity, which is, as we understand the biology of aging, we come to realize the biology behind things we knew already. You knew already that eating a lot of fruits and vegetables that have good antioxidants, is a good solution for living longer. And now we're saying, okay, well, we just are understanding the science behind that a little bit. And then I want to mention one other drug, and that's metformin. Metformin is it's a commonly prescribed medication for people with type 2 diabetes, and it helps lower their blood sugar. And so we know it has anti-aging effects because it reduces blood sugar, and that is we know that high blood sugar has ill effects. But it also seems to have anti-aging effects independent of that. So it reduces appetite, which can provide some of the benefits of caloric restriction. It may reduce mitochondrial activity, so we get fewer reactive oxygen molecules. So fundamentally, metformin seems to be getting at these core pathways that are associated with aging. And it's widely prescribed already. Its side effects tend to be fairly well tolerated. There's sometimes scientists that think that metformin is really the closest we have right now to an anti-aging drug. Okay, so we can kind of sum up where we are so far with these cellular changes by looking at what goes on in a cell as it becomes senescent, as it ages. So we saw that its mitochondria are no longer functioning right, so it's not making as much ATP, and it's producing those reactive oxygen molecules. We're seeing that we get less methylation, and that's leading to proteins being made inappropriately, and the cell also thinking that there's viruses and producing these inflammatory signals. And we know inflammation in the long term causes a whole bunch of nasty things associated with aging. And then we also see that the senescent cells have short telomeres, and so they're not able to divide. And so altogether, senescent cells are cells that have really ended their useful life, but are now producing harmful compounds that are triggering aging in other body tissues. And so it would be really great if we could figure out a way of getting rid of senescent cells. The idea here, this diagram shows, okay, with age or injury, we get these senescent cells forming. They produce these inflammatory signals that increases your risk for cancer, that causes cell damage. What if we could remove these senescent cells? Maybe the tissue would regenerate and we would regain normal function and we would lose all those inflammatory signals. And there are some medications that can do this. Unfortunately, kind of like rapamycin, they have really nasty side effects. So dasatinib is an example. This is a leukemia drug. But if we look at its side effects, low white blood cells and platelets, anemia, rashes, diarrhea, bleeding, pulmonary edema, heart failure, I mean, not things that we're going to want to be prescribing long term. But again, a place where it may be that with drug design, we can figure out how to do this better. This has been done successfully in animal models like mice. They figured out how to remove the senescent cells, and they've seen reduction in markers of aging and extending lifespan. So I think this is a place to keep an eye on. It might be a place where we see significant progress in the coming years. One place where senescent cells really make a difference is in the fat tissue. Subcutaneous fat, the fat right under our skin, accumulates senescent cells, and they're no longer able to do the job they're supposed to do, which is take in extra nutrient molecules and store them. And they're producing those inflammatory signals. And since they're not doing the job they're supposed to do, those extra nutrient molecules have to be stored somewhere, and so they start accumulating as visceral fat. And visceral fat is a particular culprit for sending out inflammatory signals. So what we see is with aging, we get less subcutaneous fat, and it works less well. And since it's not doing its job, but there's still fat molecules to be tucked away, we end up getting additional visceral fat. And that visceral fat is particularly dangerous for health. So if we could figure out how to destroy senescent cells, I think this is a place where destroying them might make the most difference. There is another possibility, though, is that some people are exploring, what if we could convert this kind of fat into a different kind of fat that was less harmful? And so there are two basic types of fat in the body. White fat or white adipose is what we think of when we think of fat. It's where we store lipids, store fats for long-term energy storage. But there's another kind of fat called brown fat. And brown fat takes in lipids and it burns them to produce heat. And so it has a lot fewer health detriments. And we used to think that it was only found in infants and in hibernating mammals, but in recent years, we've learned that even adults maintain a certain amount of brown fat. We also know that it's possible to convert white fat to brown fat. And that one of the things that does that is cold exposure. So in the dark corners of the internet, you can find people who will sell you cold vests, which will keep you cold in the hope that will help you lose weight or convert your white fat to brown fat and age more slowly. You can also see people toting the benefits of cold showers or skinny dipping in cold mountain lakes. There are also people who are exploring the use of medications to do this. So mirabegron is a bladder relaxant. It's prescribed for people with overactive bladders. But as a side effect, it seems to increase the production of brown fat. And so the dark tissue in the shoulders of this person, that's the brown fat. And you can see how the brown fat levels have increased. So I don't think converting white fat to brown fat is going to be the end all of aging, but it could end up being one piece of a suite of interventions that could help more people live to be old. Okay, so there's one more thing about aging that I want to talk about, and that's the thymus gland. So the thymus is the place where some of our white blood cells go to mature. And it reaches its maximum size at about 10 years old. And then it declines throughout adulthood until by late adulthood, it's pretty much non-functional. And this is why older individuals have a harder time mounting an immune response to new infections. They don't have this training ground for their white blood cells anymore. And we see this being correlating with increases in mortality from infectious diseases with age. This graph shows the flu, but you also know that COVID-19 has much higher mortality in older individuals. So if we're going to solve issues of aging, we do have to solve issues of older people being more susceptible to infection. And there is a whole bunch of people who are working on this, from what seems like very much pseudoscience without any real clear understanding of how this would work. You can find people who will offer to rejuvenate your thymus gland. But there's also serious scientific papers who are working in animal models or in kind of petri dishes to figure out how to regrow the thymus. And I think that it's likely that we'll see breakthroughs in the future. So another area to keep an eye on. So that's kind of the end of the things that are occurring with aging that I wanted to talk about. But I also want to tell you about a particular kind of weird experiment that suggests other things that we might be able to do that might address issues of aging. So the experiment is called parabiosis, and it involves sewing mice together so that they share a circulatory system. And what they found when they did this is that the old mice, if you do this with a young mouse and an old mouse, that the old mouse lives longer. And then even if you later separate it, it lives longer than it would have if you hadn't done this experiment. So there's something protective about young blood that's crossing over and kind of rejuvenating these old mice. And this has led to people who will sell you for thousands of dollars. They will sell you plasma extracted from young donors and that you can take in an attempt to rejuvenate yourself. But before this turns us all into vampires sucking the blood of the young, it would be good if we could actually figure out what exactly it is in young blood that is causing those rejuvenating effects. Because then we could maybe deal with those molecules directly instead of dealing with whole blood or plasma. And there's a couple of candidates. One is oxytocin. And oxytocin is a really interesting molecule. It's a hormone, and it has a bunch of different jobs at different times in our lives. So it triggers labor in pregnant women. It triggers milk letdown during lactation. It's produced during intimacy, and it is associated with feelings of pair bonding and closeness. So it's sometimes called the cuddle hormone. And it seems to be one of the things that's crossing from young mice into old mice and causing this protective effect. It is available as a medication. So for example, when people get their labor gets induced, they're being given oxytocin. And so it may be that we see oxytocin being prescribed as an anti-aging medication, but it would be simpler to go hug your sweetie or your grandkids because that produces your own rush of oxytocin. And this is yet another example of where scientific knowledge is catching up with what we knew already, which is we know that people with lots of social connections live longer than people who are isolated and alone. And I think that knowledge is partially fundamental to your organization, right? That part of your mission is to keep people with social connections. And so here we're seeing oxytocin being behind some of that. Another candidate that emerged from these parabiosis studies is called growth differentiation factor number 11. And what it seems to do is increase the stemminess of cells, like make them more like stem cells. And when this paper was published, rapidly on its heels, a new company was developed that claimed that it was going to develop drugs based on growth differentiation factor 11. And in fact, they said they were going to have their first clinical trials in 2023. I went to their website recently, and right now they say that their focus is on stroke research, and they're not making any mention of growth differentiation factor 11. So I don't know if it's still on the radar or not. Although this study does suggest that it could have rejuvenating effects, there is also some reason for concern because it works by making stem cells more like stem cells, meaning they turn on the telomerase and things like that. And we saw that that's one of the characteristics of cancer, that cancer cells are also more like stem cells. And so treating somebody with a medication that's going to make all of their cells act more like stem cells might be a recipe for disaster, and then it might make cancer start springing out everywhere. So I think this is a place to keep an eye on, but I'm not convinced that it's going to be the end all solution for aging. So I'm getting close to the end here, but I would be totally remiss if I didn't point out that the thing that we know that reduces aging the most, other than maybe caloric restriction, is exercise. So it has all sorts of effects. We know it's associated with maintaining muscle mass. We saw that from that beginning slide. It also increases bone density. Physical forces is what stimulates cells to build more bone. Exercising skeletal muscles can take up glucose, even in the absence of insulin. So exercise, it goes a long way towards helping people maintain their blood glucose levels. And we know high blood glucose is associated with a lot of ill effects. It promotes good heart health. It improves mood and cognition. Like, as this scientist here from the Buck Institute for Research on Aging says, if you could put the benefits of exercise into a pill, it would be an astonishing pill. It would be insane. But the good thing is that we don't have to put it into a pill, because we can actually do it in its original form. There is a sort of dose-dependent effect here. So in general, more exercise is better than less exercise. But any amount of exercise is better than no amount of exercise. So even moderate changes of getting up and moving around more can make a big difference. So some of the take-home messages here might be, yes, hug your kids, eat lots of plants, fruits and vegetables, don't smoke, and get plenty of exercise. But all that was stuff that you knew anyway. We can pretty much sum up by saying, all right, what we've talked about is the biological changes that occur with aging. We saw muscle loss and increased visceral fat. We saw reduced elasticity, shorter telomeres, reduced methylation leading to inappropriate gene expression. We saw mitochondrial dysfunction leading to the production of those reactive oxygen molecules. We see many of these changes are accumulating in these cells, these senescent cells that produce these inflammatory signals. That inflammation by itself has a whole bunch of ill effects. And then we saw the thymus gland shrinking away so that we can't respond to infection. And so we talked about these things, and we talked about kind of where science is at in terms of how we can solve some of these. And if you're really interested in this kind of stuff, then I could recommend this book. It's called Spring Chicken. It came out a couple of years ago, but it's still pretty topical, and it's very readable, and it covers a lot of the science that I've talked about here. But it also goes into some of the ethical or moral issues that come up when you talk about extending human lifespan. And those are beyond the scope of this talk or my expertise as a biologist. But what kind of world would it be if lots more people live to be very old? And with that, I'm done, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
So unmute yourselves, folks, if you have some questions for Claire. Claire, thank you. That was incredible, as always. Just a lot to take in.
How do you do the questions?
Linda, go ahead, Linda.
Okay, I just wanted, way back when you said that Washington and Minnesota were long-lived states, because do you think that has anything, that's because they're cold? But that wouldn't make sense, because then North Dakota and Michigan and all of those states would be long-lived. So what's the deal in Washington and Minnesota?
I think that there is a weak pattern with people living longer in cold places. But I think, and that could be a piece of it, but I think there's lots of other things going on. So it's also a question of education is associated with increased longevity, probably because it leads to better diet and more time for exercise. And so that is definitely an element of it. So I'm guessing that it's education level and access to healthcare that's driving those changes rather than the cold directly.
What about exercise or outdoor activities? Is that?
I think, yeah, I think probably if you live in Washington, you're on average likely to be getting more exercise than if you live in some of those places that, like Mississippi, where it's very hot and humid. So yeah, I think exercise could very well be a piece of it. And also racial distribution in those states probably also influences it. So we saw from that earlier slide that Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans live longer than white Americans, who live longer than Black Americans. And so as we go, if we look in different countries, in different states, we have different different numbers of people in those different groups, and that's leading to changes in the overall life expectancy.
Yeah, I got a question. I'm not sure I heard any mention of the mental health aspects influence on aging. Because I've heard that basically a bad attitude can be, shorten your life to some degree.
I think that's true. Yeah, but I don't know the biology behind it exactly, other than we know that things like oxytocin is associated with mood and is associated with longevity. But yeah, I didn't get into anything about cognition, so I didn't talk about cognitive decline at all either. Just, you could do a whole other talk on that probably.
You said that exercise helped cognition.
It does, yeah.
And Claire, is the cognition aspect of it covered in that Spring Chicken book?
There is some elements of that in Spring Chicken, yeah. There was a really interesting study they discussed where they went into some nursing homes and they put people on either caloric restricted diets or not, and then they looked at changes in life expectancy in those different groups. And so you can find all sorts of things about exercise, about caloric restriction, about cognition in that book.
Yeah, I've also heard about nursing homes or assisted living places that incorporated animal and plant care into the setting, and that increased activity level and a lot of other things. So that would all fit with what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and with what Ed is saying about, feeling senses of connection and purpose are definitely associated with increased life. Although I don't know the biology behind them. It's not hard to imagine that there's biology behind them.
And is
I
that
was going to ask a question. Can I ask a question? Mary Lou and I know somebody that had kidney transplant, and they lived way longer than they were expected to, and they never got cancer. And I wondered if there was something about the drugs that a lot of people take who've had transplants that seems to stop cancer. You don't know anything about.
Well, I mean, so rapamycin is an immunosuppressant and is sometimes given to people with with transplants or with autoimmune disorders. And so I wouldn't be totally surprised if somebody who needed an immunosuppressant who was given something like rapamycin experienced some benefits from that.
Oh. Interesting.
other questions?
What happened to choosing the right parents?
There is definitely a genetic component to extreme longevity. In fact, there's a quote in that book that says, essentially, if you want to live to be 80, eat well, get plenty of exercise. If you want to live to be 100, inherit good genes from your parents. So there's definitely genetic components, but again, that was beyond what I could talk about in one talk.
Claire, did anything that you preparing for this completely, take you by surprise, or was it stuff that or make you want to learn more about or find out more about?
Well, I had used the Spring Chicken in a class. So I had used Spring Chicken for a non-majors biology class where we did biology of the lifespan. We talked about embryonic development and childhood development, and then a section on aging. And so I dug into the research on aging a few years ago for that. It turned out not to be a great choice for YBC students who, for the most part, are young and they were not that interested in the biology of aging. But I don't think too much of what I did putting this together caught me by surprise. I hadn't thought that much about the methylation pattern, so that was something I dug into more. And I think the elasticity was the piece that's not really covered in that book, but that I stumbled into when I was doing research. And just thinking, I mean, obviously we know elasticity declines with age, but really thinking about it as one of the core limiting factors that might be dictating our maximum life expectancy. That was definitely.
Well, thank you so much. Are there other questions? Fortunately for us, we can go and watch this because we didn't catch all of it on the website. Chrissy will send the link. I, for one, am going to go back and try to get my head around some pieces of it. I don't know about this fasting, this intermittent fasting thing is fascinating to me.
Yeah. And, you know, we've known for a long time that caloric restriction reduces aging, increases lifespan. Discovering that fasting does most of the same thing is a fairly new addition. And more people can bring themselves to fast than they can to reduce calories long term. So lots of people who are in anti-aging research apply this to their own lives. And so they have food protocols where periodically, once a week or once a month, they go a day without eating. And it's easier for most people to bring themselves to not eat for a period of time than it is to day in and day out reduction of calories.
Yeah, it just seems like caloric restriction. You can only lose so much weight before your body starts eating your muscles for energy. That kind of baffles my brain.
Yeah, so the idea is to hit the minimum calories that allow you to not be malnourished. Like this caloric restriction, it has to be a number of calories that allow you to not be malnourished and yet don't provide any additional calories. And that can be a fine line.
Yeah. Oh.
It also just isn't something that most people really want to do.
No.
Who wants to live forever if you don't get to
You can't eat chocolate.
Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, I think an interesting topic would be to have a session on somebody talking about health food, you know, what's good and what's not good, you know, because the health food industry is a, you know, multi-billion-dollar industry, you know, and there's a lot of stuff out there that's worthless, as Claire pointed out. And that'd just be interesting because every time you turn on the TV or you know, somebody's pitching something at you, you know, and what's good and what's not good, you know. So I think that would be an interesting topic.
What is healthy eating, or what?
Well, yeah, but I mean, also just beware, particularly with older people, of being sold a bill of goods by the health food industry. You know, and you know, I think the regulations on that are pretty loose, you know. So I think there's stuff out there that is probably worthless, you know, as Claire pointed out. But then there's probably stuff out there that's, you know, worthwhile too. So how do you decide from one to the other, you know?
Yeah, the Consumer Reports on Health kind of a newsletter has a lot of information about that. I should start collecting it, but I mean, it's not the be all and end all, but it is interesting because it brings up the very issues you're talking about.
I'll never forget chuckling when I noticed that there was a special area of Safeway grocery store for the nutrition department.
It was really small, right?
As though regular food doesn't count as nutrition.
Yeah.
That's great. Good. Okay. Well, thank you. Judy, your sound's off.
Oh, sorry. One thing that you can do is go into a health food store and take the bottle off the shelf and then look for the tiny print that you can hardly see that says this product has not been tested nor approved by the FDA. That's one
Ah,
clue. And they make
yeah,
it so tiny that you can't even see it.
Yeah.
And then somebody with an 8th grade education walks up to you and then tells you how wonderful it is for your memory and all that stuff. So that's one thing to look for.
Hmm. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I just have 2 quick announcements. One is that tomorrow night Chrissy's going to send this out again. Audubon's talking about Woodpeckers Part 2, 7 o'clock on Zoom or in person at the Arboretum. Don't miss it. Looks good. And in a month, March 22nd, we have Neil Barg coming to talk about the scope and challenges of the Yakima Health District, the Yakima County Health District. So that should be a great presentation also. And turns out Claire and Neil know each other and have worked together at various points. So we're looking forward to having Neil come to us next month. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you, Chrissy, for figuring out these 2 recordings. Thank you for getting back onto Zoom, Claire. That was a different experience, and we were very happy to see you back.
Yeah,
Claire-
I'm really sorry
Claire,
that
you-
happened. I have no idea what happened.
Claire, you did a fantastic job. It was really interesting.
Very
Thanks,
interesting.
Ed. I appreciate that.
Fantastic. All right. Well, have a great evening, everybody, and thanks for showing up. We appreciate it.